Hello, welcome to our EU for Belarus Support for Advanced Learning and Training Academic Research Project Grants guide for the financial aspects. So, as you could understand, today we're going to review all the financial aspects of this application call. So, first of all, the indicative amount made available under this call for proposals is 1 million euros, which are divided into two lots for €500,000. The first lot is for academic research projects in the field of social sciences or humanities, and the preferable criteria for those applications that the subject of research includes Belarus. And the second lot is dedicated for the academic research projects in all other academic sciences and research areas that are not eligible to apply to Lot 1. For the size of grants, each individual grant can fall between the range of minimum amount of 50,000 euros and the maximum amount of 100,000 euros. Each of those grants are financed by the European Union by either 80%, which is the minimum amount of percentage that can be financed from European Union funds, and the maximum percentage is 95%, which leads us to the co-financing rates, and the minimum of that rates are between 5 and 20% of co-financing. And now we're going to review the eligibility of costs. Basically, there are two types of costs in these research project grants. There are direct costs, which are directly linked to the implementation of the project, and indirect costs, which are not directly linked with the implementation of the project, but are considered as administration costs for all the direct costs. And they are still required to be for the successful project implementation. All of the incurred costs must comply with the provisions of Article 14 of the general conditions to the standard grant contract, and they should be based on actual costs incurred by the beneficiaries. Also, the costs must be incurred during the implementation of the action after the final signature of the grant contract. Those costs must be supported by relevant documentation, which will be requested. So please bear in mind to collect all the supporting documents so the audit and other cost eligibility processes would be smoother. Here is a chart for all the cost eligibility criteria that you should definitely refer to while evaluating whether or not costs for your research grant is eligible. So the first point is that the cost should be incurred during the implementation of the action. The second point that I want to emphasize is that they should be indicated in the estimated overall budget, which will be required for you to sign the grant contract. The third point is that they should be necessary for the implementation of the action, meaning that the research could not be implemented without those costs. The fourth point is that they should be clearly identifiable and verifiable. As previously mentioned, for the purposes of future audits or even the simple accounting and financial requirements of the project. The fifth point is that they should comply with the requirements and applicable tax and social legislation, both on a national and European Union level. For the sixth point, they should be reasonable, justified, and comply with the requirements and of sound financial management, meaning that the invoices should have all the supporting documents and contracts should be signed during the implementation of the action. For the eligibility of direct costs, we will dive deeper into what's eligible and what's not. So first of all, we have the human resources, which consist of gross salaries, including social security charges and other remuneration-related costs. Please note that the bonuses are not eligible criteria for the cost to be directly included in the project implementation process. Other costs that are related to the research team members' participation in events should be deemed as eligible direct costs, meaning that all the costs required for conferences, seminars, workshops, and other fees will be deemed as eligible direct costs. For those conferences, seminars, and workshops to be successful and full of academic research project implementation, travel and subsistence costs are also required for the staff. So those costs will also be deemed as eligible direct costs. For the successful publishing of your research, the peer review and editing costs of project results will be also deemed as eligible. And they are related with the publishing, translation, editing, and visibility fees. If there is a need for software essential for project implementation, those costs will be also deemed as eligible direct costs. Each of the projects have to have an audit verification cost, and they should not exceed 1% of total costs. For the duties, taxes, and charges, including VAT, paid and not recoverable by the beneficiaries related to the purposes of the action, the VAT costs and other taxes will be deemed as eligible as well. Other financial services, such as bank guarantee costs, will also be deemed as eligible if previously agreed and fixated in the budget. For the specific requirements of eligible direct costs, it should be noted that purchase costs for services and for creating fixed assets, for example, previously mentioned software, they should not exceed more than 10% of the eligible costs. As previously mentioned, for the audit verification costs, they shall be included in the budget of the action, and they should not exceed 1% of total direct costs. However, if applicant presents justified grounds, this requirement of maximum 1% of total costs could be reviewed on case-by-case basis, and the budgets can be transferred without exceeding approval total budget amount. For the cost of guarantees or other suretyship services for the amount of the initial pre-financing payment provided by financial institutions or insurance undertakings, they shall be included in the budget of the action as well. In the final evaluation stage, contracting authority will decide necessity of those guarantee shops, taxes, and in some cases, bank guarantee may be avoided by agreeing with the contracting authority at the contract preparation stage to adjust the amount of pre-financing. After the submission of the application, there is no possibility to increase budget by adding costs for the guarantee. If the applicant is deemed as not required to submit guarantee, the total budget will not be reduced, and the amount intended for the bank guarantee will be redistributed to other budget categories. For establishing eligibility criteria for all the costs that you are planning on using during the implementation of the project, please refer to Guidelines for Applicants, Section 2, 4.1.4, eligible actions for which an applicant may be made, and evaluate if the type of action meets the criteria of expected outputs. We will move on to the eligible indirect costs and dive deeper on what costs are deemed as eligible indirect costs. So first of all, it should be noted that the indirect costs incurred in carrying out the action may be eligible for flat rate funding. The total of flat rate funding should not exceed 7% of the estimated total eligible direct costs. Indirect costs are eligible provided that they do not include or duplicate the cost assigned to another budget heading in the standard grant contract. For the lead applicant, it should be noted that they may be asked to justify why they chose a flat rate percentage, which is requested before the grant contract is signed. However, once the flat rate has been fixed in the special conditions of the grant contract, no supporting documents have to be provided during the implementation phase. If any of the applicants or affiliated entities is in the receipt of operating grant financed by the European Union, it may not claim indirect costs on its incurred cost within the proposed budget of the action. However, there are two ways of getting a reimbursement of eligible indirect costs. First way is that the actual costs incurred by the beneficiaries and affiliated entities will be fixated. And as previously mentioned, simplified cost option, which is a flat rate financing. Please note that flat rate financing is only applicable for indirect costs. Direct costs are based only on actually incurred costs. Let's move on and see what's ineligible costs. The following costs will be described as not eligible in the action. For example, debts and debt services or other charges such as interest should not be deemed as eligible. Provisions for losses or potential future liabilities should not be deemed as eligible. Costs declared by the beneficiaries and financed by another action or work program receiving an European Union grant. Also, under this call of proposals, it cannot be deemed eligible any purchases of land or buildings except where necessary for the direct implementation of the action, in which case ownership must be transferred in accordance with Article 7.5 of the General Conditions of the Standard Grant Contract, at the latest at the end of the action. Also, currency exchange losses are not considered eligible costs. Any in-kind contributions, including volunteers' work, should not be deemed as eligible costs. As previously mentioned, bonuses of the staff will not be considered as eligible costs. Any negative interest charged by the banks or other financial institutions is also ineligible. Any credit to third parties is also ineligible. Please note that other costs which do not meet the requirements of eligibility and, or maybe, were not planned in the approval budget are also ineligible. Moving on to the eligibility of VAT costs. For the eligibility of VAT costs, it should be assessed before the budget is drawn up. Eligibility of VAT should be assessed of all partners and leading applicant as well. and it should be described at the level of project activities. If VAT is eligible, it should be included in the budgeted expenditure. If VAT is ineligible, it should be excluded from the budgeted expenditure. First of all, it is needed to answer the question who is applicant partner. For example, if it's a public body of European member state, or maybe it's a private body, or maybe public legal entity. Depending on those criteria, the eligibility of VAT will be considered. Another question to be evaluated before drawing conclusions on eligibility of VAT, should be will revenue be generated from project activity? So it is needed to note that specific project activities to be carried out and expected to generate income will not be deemed as eligible VAT costs. Also, if the grant receives the income, the VAT costs will be deemed ineligible. And the final question for you to evaluate before your application: will activity be taxable for purposes of VAT? So here's a chart of VAT costs and how they should be evaluated if they're eligible or not. For example, if the income will not be received from the economic project activity, there is no right for deduction and VAT is deemed eligible. If the income was or is received from the economic project activity, you have to evaluate is income taxable for VAT. If no, then VAT is also eligible. And if yes, it should be evaluated if the entity is registered as VAT payer. If yes, it can get a refund from the budget and VAT is therefore deemed ineligible. And if no, whether or not the entity should register as VAT payer and refund from the budget. Therefore, the VAT tax will be also deemed as ineligible under this call of proposals. Documentation for VAT should be submitted in this order. As you can see, in the application annexes, there is Annex J, which is Declaration of Honor on VAT eligibility if applicant considers that VAT is eligible for funding. It should be merged with Annex J1, which is a confirmation of eligibility of VAT from the expert. Any type of expert could be taken into consideration and draw the final signature on Declaration of Honor. It can be lawyer, auditor, accountant, or etc. If declaration is not submitted by the application, VAT would be considered as not eligible. Please note that the Declaration of Honor must be filled by the applicant and each of co-applicants separately. As previously mentioned, Annex G1 should be a part of Annex J. So the expert confirmation also approves that the information in Annex J is correct, and he evaluated that information to be deemed as correct. In an ideal situation, they should be merged documents. Moving on to the research grants budget preparation. So, how to prepare the budget for academic research project grants? First of all, draw a clear, transparent, comprehensive, and realistic budget. Avoid rough estimation of costs. Please make sure that all costs are justified. Avoid arithmetical errors. and clearly describe budget headlines and items in justification. The second thing to be aware of while drawing the budget, that the budget should demonstrate coherence with your accounting policies. Please include your cost allocation principles and show good accounting practices. As previously reviewed, please check eligibility principles and criteria. No costs included in the budget should be ineligible. And also, we will revise the structure of the budget. So the structure of the budget is that applicants are free to add any necessary budget line. Preferably, total amount of the proposed budget line should not exceed 50 entries. Human resources should not be consolidated. So meaning that each of the budget line should be dedicated for each of the staff members. Any significant events should be recorded in the budget. Similar costs under the same cost categories can be consolidated under a single budget line. Also, details on subcosts can be described in justification and not included as separate budget subline. Here is the template of the budget. So it is fixated as Annex B in guidelines for applicants. A few general recommendations for the budget. Please review instructions in the budget tab below of the budget table. It will provide you the directions on how to indicate requested amounts for each budget category. Then complete the data in all tabs in Budget tab. Then move on to Justification tab and justify filled-in budget lines, and they should be similar to the first tab of the budget. In expected sources of funding, indicate contribution amount and other relevant information. So talking about the first tab, which is a budget tab, please indicate the unit, then number of units, each unit value in euros, and the total amount of costs in euros. As you can see, there are 4 separate columns for that. In justification, please provide the clear and narrative and coherent clarification also for each budget line calculation. Please note that those are only examples, and you can adapt the justification part for your own required cost for project implementation. In the third tab, expected sources of funding, it should be indicated the percentage from European Union financing. Then, the co-financing cost should be indicated as well. Please note that there are different ranges for each application that must fall between 80 to 95% of European Union financing and 5 to 20% of co-financing. Also, please bear in mind that in-kind contribution and volunteers' work are ineligible in this call. Moving on to the separate budget lines, we will firstly talk about human resources. So the main principles of planning human resources. Costs should be foreseen for staff to be hired via employment contract or service contract. But if staff is hired via a service contract, it should be included in the new subheading 5.9.2 or heading 6 of the budget. The rate of the human resources should follow the existing salary structure within the organization for a similar position. Salary costs of the personnel of national administrations may be eligible to the extent that they relate to the cost of activities, which the relevant public authority would not carry out if the action were not undertaken. For the justification part, please describe the role and responsibilities of each position and determine of unit value. As for describing the human resources, full-time equivalent should be used to calculate salaries. Full-time equivalent is the hours worked by one employee on a full-time basis, which is typically considered 40 hours per week in European Union. A 40-hour employee should be shown as 1.00 full-time equivalent. If the staff member is working 30 hours, for example, it should be shown as 0.75 full-time equivalent. Budget line name should include full-time equivalent percentage. Please enter the calculated full-time annual salary, percentage of time that will be spent on the grant objectives, here are some examples on how human resources could be calculated and justified. Please note that the adaptation for your own research project should be done. Another budget line is second one, the travel costs. So for the travel costs, please specify the cost per person of travel expenses and including their transportation costs and per diem. Please explain on which budget line of the event you are referring to. For the per diems, European Union has issued specific rates that may be used for calculation of travel costs. Please refer to the link provided in the slides. It is also provided in the General Conditions, Article 14.2. Please note that travel and subsistence costs should be evaluated by the national law as well. For the budget line, other costs and services, the specific requirements are issued. As previously mentioned, audit verification costs should be included in the budget of the action. Other requirements for audit verification costs are explained in the slide 10. The cost of guarantees or suretyship services for the amount of the initial pre-financing payment provided by institutions or insurance undertaking shall be included in the budget action as well. Please list and provide a brief description of meetings and any events related to the grant objectives. Justification all the expenses and break out the costs and provide clear and coherent information on how costs were determined. Please note that the external body for purposes of auditing should be a prior authorized by Central Project Management Agency. For the specific line in budget block of other costs and services, which is named software for project implementation, it should be specifically dedicated for the project, meaning that the software cannot be not related to the research object. Purchase cost for services for creating fixed assets should not exceed 10% of the total eligible cost. In the justification part, please indicate the number of items to be purchased at the unit price. Justification of expense with breakout of expenses and information how costs were determined should be also provided in a clear and coherent way in the Justification tab. And other provisions of this research grant projects. So the indirect costs can be up to 7% flat rate of the budget line 7. Please refer to the subtotal of direct eligible cost of the action. Please note that confirmation that entity has no operational grant should be submitted as well. In this call for proposals, contingency reserve may not be included in the budget, and any contributions in kind are deemed as ineligible. Also, please refer to the questions and answers about the call application if you still have concerns. Thank you for your attention.